On April 26, 1945, Heinrich Miller, head of the Gestapo, was last seen in the Chancellery bunker in Berlin. The city was on the brink of collapse under the Soviet advance, and the Nazi regime was facing its end. That day, Müller personally supervised the interrogation and execution of Hermann Fegelein, SS Division General and brother-in-law of Eva Braun. Under direct orders, Müller led Fegelein to the Chancellery basement, where he was tortured for information on possible conspiracies. Shortly after, he was executed. After the execution, Heinrich Müller disappeared. While other high-ranking Nazis like Himmler and Goebbels made definitive decisions in their final days, Müller's whereabouts became an enigma. Officially, he was declared dead in May 1945, and his body was attributed to a grave in the Neukölln cemetery. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the grave was empty. The discovery of the empty grave in Neukölln reinforced the idea that his disappearance was not accidental. Official investigations carried out in the 1960s concluded that the remains buried there did not belong to Müller. Without physical evidence or conclusive testimonies, the fate of the Gestapo chief remained shrouded in mystery. In 2013, the story took an unexpected turn. Johannes Tuchel, director of the German Resistance Memorial, found a record in the district archives of Mitte, Berlin, documenting Müller's death and burial in a Jewish cemetery in the same neighborhood. According to the archives, the burial took place during the chaos of the war's final days, when ruins prevented normal cemetery operations and many burials were carried out provisionally. Over time, this temporary burial was forgotten and became permanent. From justice to darkness, the enigma of Kurt Daluege's burial. What happened to Kurt Daluege after his execution has remained shrouded in mystery, fueling speculation for decades. After the end of World War II, he was arrested by British forces and extradited to Czechoslovakia, where he faced trial for crimes against humanity. The atrocities he oversaw, such as the massacre of the village of Lidice in retaliation for Reinhard Heydrich's assassination, were central to the charges. Despite overwhelming evidence, Daluege maintained throughout the judicial process that he was only following superior orders and always acted in the interest of the German nation. The trial, which began in September 1946, attracted international attention. The verdict was decisive: guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal sentenced him to death, and he was executed by hanging on October 24th in the courtyard of Pankrak prison in Prague. After his execution, Daluege's body was buried in an unmarked grave at Pankrak Cemetery, a common practice for condemned Nazi figures. The decision not to identify his final resting place stemmed from the fear that his grave could become a shrine for sympathizers of the fallen regime. This swift and anonymous burial was carried out without ceremony, in line with the effort to erase any trace of his image from public memory. Specific details of the burial were kept secret. Czech authorities minimally documented the process, leaving an information void that over time became fertile ground for rumors and conspiracy theories. Although there is no official evidence to support the idea that his remains were exhumed or moved, persistent rumors suggest they might have been destroyed to ensure no physical trace of his existence remained. Daluege's case highlights the complexity of managing historical memory after World War II. On one hand, there was the need for justice for the atrocities committed. On the other, authorities had to take measures to prevent any possible resurgence of extremism. In this context, the decision to bury him in an unmarked grave and keep the burial details secret reflected a pragmatic approach to dealing with his legacy. In the years following the war, researchers and journalists have tried to reconstruct the events related to prominent Nazi figures like Daluege. However, in his specific case, the lack of documentation and the deliberately clandestine nature of his burial have hampered these efforts. Most attempts to locate his grave or verify theories about the body have been unsuccessful, leaving many questions unanswered. The final resting place of Albert Speer: secrets and speculations after his burial. Albert Speer, German architect and politician, died on September 1, 1981, in London, England, due to complications related to a recently diagnosed cancer. Having held a prominent position in the Nazi regime as the chief architect and later as Minister of Armaments, he spent his final years publishing books and reflecting on his role in the Third Reich. However, What happened after his death with his mortal remains and burial has been a subject of historical interest and speculation. After his death, his family and close associates organized a private ceremony. Despite his notoriety, any significant public manifestation that could be interpreted as a glorification of his image was avoided. His burial reflected his life after his conviction, discreet, with a deliberate effort to maintain a low profile. Speer was buried in Bergfriedhof Heidelberg, a cemetery not far from cities like Mannheim. Despite this choice, the exact location of his grave was known but kept under strict discretion. They did not want it to become widely public. The decision was consistent with a widespread policy in Germany and other countries that had suffered German occupation, to deny any physical space that could serve as a symbol of support for the National Socialist ideology. No ostentatious tombstone or any other marker that could draw attention was erected. According to available reports, Albert's grave did not differ from the others in the cemetery, making it difficult to identify its precise location. This secrecy also reflected Speer's desire to maintain a low profile after his release in 1966 and his family's insistence on avoiding controversy. In the following years, rumors and speculations arose about the fate of his remains. Some suggested that they might have been secretly exhumed and relocated elsewhere. These theories, however, lack concrete evidence. Others speculated that the burial in Bergfriedhof Heidelberg was a facade, and that Speer might have been buried in a completely different location. But the lack of official records available to the public has left these claims in the realm of speculation. Despite the precautions, interest in his figure continued after his death. His memoirs, especially Inside the Third Reich, published during his lifetime, generated academic and public debates. He tried to portray himself in life as a repentant technocrat, detached from the most atrocious political decisions of the regime, although his responsibility as Minister of Armaments and his use of forced labor contradicted this image. In fact, it was historians who began to dismantle that image that the deceased tried to project, arguing that Speer had been aware and complicit in many aspects of the Nazi regime. This occurred mainly in the 1990s, a time when the Cold War had ended, and the idea of clarifying many aspects of the former communist countries intensified. The funeral of a butcher, the last goodbye to Reinhard Hydra. After his death on June 4, 1942, as a result of an attack carried out by members of the Czechoslovak resistance, Reinhard Hydra was buried with honors in a ceremony marked by the magnitude of his figure within the Nazi structure. The official's funeral took place 5 days after his physical departure in Berlin, at the Reich Chancellery. The ceremony was imbued with symbolism and pomp. High-ranking government officials, including Adolf Hitler, attended the event to pay tribute to one of the main architects of the Holocaust and protector of the regime in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Wagner's funeral march was played, underscoring his position as a key figure in that framework. However, the tone of the ceremony was not without reproaches, as Hitler expressed his frustration over what he considered Heydrich's imprudent mistake of not traveling with greater protection. Reinhard's initial burial took place in a prominent area within Berlin, the Invalids' Cemetery, receiving great military honors. But this final resting place would not remain his definitive resting place. Germany's defeat, which occurred 3 years later, brought a radical change in the perception and handling of the remains of prominent Nazi leaders. The Soviet authorities, who occupied Berlin after the regime's collapse, took measures to prevent any kind of posthumous glorification of figures like him. Reports from the time indicate that the tombstone and his name were removed. This act had a clear purpose: to erase any physical trace that could serve as a reference point for those seeking to exalt his legacy. In the following years, rumors and speculations arose about Heydrich's whereabouts. Some historians have suggested that additional investigations into his body might have been carried out, partly to confirm his identity and analyze the exact circumstances of his death. However, these details lack official confirmation due to the destruction of many documents during the chaos of the war's end and the Allied occupation. Over time, his image has been the subject of analysis and debates. In Prague and Lidice, monuments have been erected to commemorate both the regime's victims and the acts of resistance that defined that era. In February 2000, a far-left group known as Autonomen Totengräber attempted to desecrate the tomb, located in the Invalids Cemetery. This group had carried out similar actions in the past, including the opening of the tomb of Nazi officer Horst Wessel, where they claimed to have thrown his skull into the Spree River, although this claim was denied by the police. During the early morning of the attempt, the activists headed to Heinrich's grave. Despite their efforts, there are no clear records indicating whether they managed to access it or if anything was taken. A second attempt occurred on December 12th, 19 years later. That day, a new robbery attempt at the tomb was discovered. Cemetery workers found a hole at the resting site, leading the police to launch an investigation. Although the tomb had been opened, nothing was taken from Heinrich's mortal remains. Subsequently, the police confirmed that the perpetrators of the robbery attempt were not identified, and there are no suspects in the investigation. From commander to prisoner, the life and death of Karl Dönitz. During World War II, Karl Dönitz stood out as a military leader and commander of the Kriegsmarine, overseeing the strategy of the German submarines, known as U-boats. At the end of the war, he briefly assumed the role of head of state. Contrary to what one might think, his tenure was short-lived. Just a few days later, Germany unconditionally surrendered. Captured by Allied forces, he was tried at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to 10 years in prison for war crimes. After serving his sentence at Spandau prison, he was released in 1956. Dönitz retired to the small town of Aumühle near Hamburg, where he spent the rest of his days in relative tranquility, writing books and defending his role during the war. On Christmas Eve 1980, he died from a heart attack. His remains were buried in the Aumühle cemetery, where he had also lived after his release. The burial was a private ceremony organized by his immediate family. The choice to bury Karl in Aumühle was not coincidental. After his release, he had lived there discreetly, avoiding the spotlight. His later years were marked by a simple life, partly financed by a state pension that generated controversy due to his role in the war. The local community of Aumühle, although aware of his presence, adopted a stance of tolerance towards his retirement in the area. While some groups might have sought to pay public homage to him, German authorities took measures to prevent his figure from being glorified. His resting place is a simple grave, without inscriptions highlighting his role or his part in the Third Reich. The political context of the time influenced how information about his burial was handled. Although the location of his grave is not strictly a secret, its location was not promoted either. This contrasts with the graves of other Nazi leaders, which in some cases have been removed to avoid symbolic connotations. In subsequent years, the tomb of the former German president remained largely out of the public eye. However, it was not devoid of interest. Although no major incidents have been recorded, rumors about possible attempts at vandalism or even exhumation for political or symbolic purposes have circulated. Nevertheless, these claims have never been supported by concrete evidence. Silenced memories. The trial and hidden legacy of Karl Hermann Frank. Karl Hermann Frank was executed on May 22, 1946, at Pankrak prison in Prague after being found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That day, his body hung from the gallows in front of officials, international representatives, and a crowd that gathered to witness the end of one of the main perpetrators of repression during the occupation of Czechoslovakia. What followed after his death has been shrouded in mystery. The body was removed from the execution site without ceremony, in a deliberate effort by Czech authorities to erase any physical trace of his existence. His corpse was transported to the Demise cemetery. The burial was conducted discreetly and under strict security measures, being interred in an anonymous grave. The purpose was that over time, the exact site where this figure lay would disappear even from institutional memory. Over the years, this decision has generated various speculations. Some rumors suggest that his body may have been secretly exhumed and relocated, although there is no concrete evidence to support this theory. Meanwhile, the context in which this clandestine burial took place reflects the deep scars that the Nazi regime left in Czechoslovakia. In the following years, academic and public interest in German figures of the time led to investigations into the life and death of Karl Hermann Frank. Although unrelated to the whereabouts of his remains, in March 2021, a significant discovery was made by Czech radio. Archivists found previously unheard recordings of his trial, This finding included approximately 1,300 discs containing more than 80 hours of recorded material from the 1946 trial. The recordings proved to be a valuable source of information, providing additional details about a judicial process that, although known, lacked some important aspects. The discovered recordings included testimonies from Czech students who had been detained and sent to concentration camps following the Nazi repression in 1939. They also contained statements from other individuals involved in the trial, including his lawyer, Kamil Resler, who had been persecuted during the occupation. Miloslav Turek, responsible for digitizing the material, explained that each disc contained approximately 3.5 minutes of recordings. The trial was continuously recorded, and each magnetic tape had a duration of about 20 minutes. Each night, a summary of the day was produced from the recordings, facilitating the preservation of the judicial process for future generations. Czech Radio committed to making this restored material available to the public and researchers, ensuring that the voices of the past are not forgotten. His loyalty was his condemnation, the fall of Ernst Röhm and his anonymous grave. Ernst Röhm was executed on July 1, 1934 at Stadelheim prison in Munich after refusing to commit suicide as offered by his captors. He was shot point-blank by SS members Theodor Eicke and Michael Lippert, marking the violent end of his controversial figure within the Nazi regime. After the execution, his remains were kept in the custody of the Third Reich authorities, who made decisions reflecting their fear of the symbolic impact his memory could have. The body was quickly transported to the Westfriedhof cemetery. There were no public ceremonies or official respects paid to the man who had once been one of Adolf Hitler's closest allies. The discretion surrounding his burial was deliberate. It was necessary to prevent him from becoming a martyr for internal opponents or a symbol of resistance among the more radical elements of the government. The grave was designed as an unmarked space, a reflection of his abrupt fall from grace. There are no records of commemorative tombstones being placed, much less monuments highlighting his influence during the early years of the Nazi Party. This decision was not only due to Hitler's disdain and his inner circle, but also to the political strategy of maintaining control over the narrative the regime wanted to perpetuate. Over the years, Röhm's resting place became shrouded in historical obscurity. World War II and the collapse of the entire German effort contributed further to erasing the traces of his burial. Although there are records of his burial in a small family plot, there is no evidence that the grave has remained a recognizable or visited space. From 1945 onwards, the new German government adopted a strict policy to dismantle any symbols associated with the fallen regime. In this context, it is speculated that Ernst may have been removed as part of this effort. However, there are no public records or official confirmations about the exhumation or relocation of his remains to another site. Additionally, the prison cemetery, like many others of the time, underwent renovations, redistributions, and possible exhumations, common post-war practices to manage limited urban spaces. These actions contributed to the loss of precise information about the final destination of the former official. Interest in Röhm and his posthumous fate persisted in the years following the war, although it largely focused on his political life and role in the internal struggles of Nazism rather than his burial. Brazil and scientific investigations, the final resting place of the Angel of Death. Josef Mangler died on February 7, 1979, in the Brazilian town of Bertioga, the victim of a heart attack while swimming in the ocean. At that time, he was living under the false name Wolfgang Gerhard, which he had adopted to avoid capture since the end of World War II. For decades, he had managed to evade authorities and Nazi hunters thanks to his ability to hide in various South American countries. His death went practically unnoticed, and it was not until years later that authorities would confirm his identity and final fate. After his death, his remains were buried in a cemetery in Embu das Arte, in the metropolitan area of São Paulo, Brazil. The discretion with which the burial was handled reflected both the desire to protect Josef's identity and the effort of his close circle to avoid attracting unwanted attention. During the years following his death, his family tried to maintain anonymity regarding his whereabouts. However, as investigations into war criminals advanced in the 1980s, rumors about his possible whereabouts in South America emerged. In 1985, a series of leads led German and Brazilian authorities to investigate the grave of Wolfgang Gerhard in Embu das Artes. Specifically, the German police intercepted letters indicating Mengele's death. These letters were sent by an Austrian couple who had helped him during his time in Brazil. This information led Brazilian police to investigate further into the doctor's whereabouts. Motivated by this, on June 21st of that year, the grave was exhumed with the sole purpose of conducting a forensic analysis and determining if it was indeed the individual they were seeking. The initial identification process was based on dental analysis, which established a significant match with available dental records of the Nazi doctor. A bone review was also conducted to determine the skeleton's age and compare specific physical characteristics, such as a hip fracture he had suffered while working in Auschwitz. In March of the following year, an old X-ray of Mangler was found that allowed a definitive comparison between the skull and the radiographic images. American and Brazilian experts confirmed that the images matched, thus solidifying the identification. The investigation continued in greater depth in the following years, culminating in 1992 with the use of DNA tests to definitively confirm that the exhumed remains belonged to Joseph. This advance was possible thanks to the comparison between the corpse and genetic samples from the criminal's living relatives. With this confirmation, authorities officially closed one of the longest chapters in the search for war criminals. Following the identification, he was transferred to the São Paulo Medical Institute. Despite international interest in repatriating him to Germany or Israel, his family has refused to allow it. Although his discovery and identification put an end to decades of uncertainty, Mengele's case continued to generate controversy. His burial under a false name, along with the circumstances of his life in exile, raised questions about the support networks that allowed him to evade justice for so long. The silent grave of Fritz Tot, a symbol of the Third Reich's decay. Fritz Tot, a German engineer and prominent figure in National Socialism, died on February 8, 1942, in a plane crash near Rastenburg, East Prussia. His unexpected death, surrounded by circumstances that have generated various speculations, marked the end of a career deeply intertwined with the military and propaganda machinery of the system he served. However, after his death, the fate of his mortal remains became a quiet matter, but not without historical interest. He was transported to Berlin, where he was honored as a hero of the regime. Adolf Hitler, who held Fritz in high esteem for his loyalty and contributions, attended the funeral, reinforcing the image of the deceased as a symbol of sacrifice and dedication to the Third Reich. Subsequently, he was buried in the Invalids' Cemetery, a place reserved for prominent military figures of Germany. Contrary to expectations, the grave was designed to be discreet. Despite the importance of his role, it was decided to keep his tomb simple, without ornamentations that could foster a cult of his memory. In the context of a regime that sought to project greatness and power through monuments and ceremonies, this decision seems to have been strategic, perhaps to avoid unwanted attention at a specific site after his death. When World War II ended and Allied forces occupied Germany, that cemetery, like other spaces associated with what Germany was abandoning, attracted the attention of the new authorities and curious individuals interested in the fall of the Nazi regime. However, Tot's remains were not exhumed, nor were significant modifications made to his grave. This contrasted with other actions taken to erase symbols of the regime, such as the destruction of monuments and the removal of Nazi emblems. Over time, interest in his figure and his grave diminished. The cemetery, located in what would become East Berlin during the Cold War, was partially abandoned and suffered significant damage. Many of the graves were destroyed or neglected during this period, either due to the impact of the war or decisions made by East German authorities, who sought to distance themselves from the recent past. The grave, however, remained intact, preserved from massive public attention and attempts at vandalism. In the following decades, academic and social interest in him remained limited. Although his legacy as an engineer and administrator in the Nazi regime is undeniable, his association with projects that involved the use of forced labor and contributed to the Third Reich's war apparatus has overshadowed any broader assessment of his technical achievements. This focus also influenced the perception of his final resting place, which has rarely been the subject of visits or mentions in broader contexts. On the few occasions when the grave has been mentioned, it has been mainly in historical studies or debates on how to handle the remains of figures associated with Nazism. Unlike other prominent members of the regime, whose burial locations have been vandalized or transformed into pilgrimage sites, Tot's grave has remained relatively anonymous. In recent decades, efforts to preserve the cemetery have led to its revaluation as a site of historical interest, although not specifically because of the presence of Tot's grave. Rather, the focus has been on the heritage value of the cemetery as a whole, reflecting the complex layers of German history from the German Empire to the Cold War period. Ashes to the sea, the exhumation of Rudolph Hess and the end of a neo-Nazi cult. The solo flight to Scotland that Rudolph Hess undertook in 1941, supposedly with the intention of negotiating peace with the United Kingdom, was one of the most unusual and mysterious acts of his life. After being captured by British authorities, he spent the rest of the war in prison, and in 1946 he was sentenced to life imprisonment, serving his sentence at Spandau Prison. In mid-August 1987, he died at the age of 93 in his cell at Spandau Prison, Berlin. The official version of his death was that it was a self-inflicted hanging, although this explanation has been the subject of intense speculation and conspiracy theories. The fate of his mortal remains began to generate controversy almost immediately after his death. When his physical disappearance was announced, his grave was not an immediate focus of attention. However, over the years it became a public focal point due to attempts by some extremist groups to use it as a cult site. These groups, some of them neo-Nazis, considered Hess a key figure in the ideology they defended, and his grave in the Wunsiedel Cemetery, a small German town, became a pilgrimage site for his followers. The grave, which bore an inscription honoring his loyalty to Hitler and the Third Reich, became a symbol fraught with controversy. Indeed, in September 2009, hundreds of supporters gathered in Wunsiedel to remember the Nazi party member. Despite bans, the far right continued to admire his final resting place. The situation became unsustainable over time. The attention the grave received from extremist groups forced German authorities to reconsider the future of the old official's stay in that cemetery. After several years of debate and growing public pressure in 2011, authorities decided to exhume Rudolph's remains and proceed with his cremation to prevent his burial site from becoming a place of veneration. The exhumation of Rudolph Hess took place on July 20th. It was a process surrounded by great secrecy, and it was decided to scatter his ashes in an unidentified lake with the aim of preventing any type of monument or ceremony that could perpetuate his figure. Although many considered his exhumation and cremation an important step to prevent the glorification of his role, others saw it as an attempt to silence an uncomfortable part of history. Today, the site where he was buried in Wunsiedel remains a place of interest, but it is no longer a focus of worship or public controversy.